Good evening, everybody. It's James Beach from Northwest Metalworks Music. This is letter B from my focus on Northwest hard rock and metal bands um, to tie in with our book Rusted Metal that we did a couple years back. First band, one of the bigger ones from the 70s, originally a Canadian band, relocated, or at least Randy Bachman did, to Tacoma, Washington. Um, Bachman Turner Overdrive. This is my personal favorite is Not Fragile, which is their third record, I believe. Um, and they had quite a few hits in the 70s, kind of beefy hard rock type stuff. Definitely pretty influential band on a lot of people. Um, my co-label partner Brian Nairn used to told me the story where when because he grew up in Tacoma and he said that when Randy Bachman moved there, he saw him in his somewhere around his neighborhood one day walking down the street with a fur coat and big old boots and stuff. So I thought that was pretty cool to see him walking down your neighborhood. um, Next one is even earlier than that, predates it by a little bit. It was a Portland wrestler named Beauregard. Let's see if we can show this. I'm going the wrong way. But so he was a wrestler who wanted to be a singer as well. Hired some musicians in Portland, most notably Greg Sage and Dave Kupel from the Wipers on guitar and bass, respectively. Um, the Testify single, especially, is one of the songs that's kind of in the MC5 sort of realm. It kind of reminds me of pretty cool, sort of early, slightly punky hard rock. Um, some of the stuff's a little blue-eyed soul, that sort of thing. So, um, an interesting mix, nevertheless. Um, Next would be, excuse me, would be Bible Stud. Did this kind of cool single that's slightly oversized. So I guess the story was it didn't. They kind of had the measurements wrong and it didn't quite fit in the 45 rack so well. But they also had a demo tape. Excuse me. Basically, you got 3/5 of Overlord here. It was Steve Van Loo, the vocalist, Glenn Logan, one of the two guitarists, and Kenny Jacobson, the drummer, along with Rick Vaughn on guitars, was studio guy for a long time, recorded a lot of stuff and still does for people, and a guy named Gundo, which I forget what his real name actually is, so I apologize, but yeah, so this was kind of cool. It had a little sticker and stuff, and insert sheet, and, so they were kind of fun. Um, Another 70s band, kind of more of a straightforward rock band, but they had a couple hard rock type songs here and there. There's a couple on this that are kind of a bit more rocking. A couple of the guys went on to be in Kid Skin later on, and Allies as well. A couple of guys, a drummer and um, Joe Shikane also replaced Rick Knotts when he left Rail in the mid '80s to go to school. So those guys were kind of cool. Um, so I don't know if this was I think this was like a self-release. Big Top was kind of a hardcore punk band, a bit of a crossover type, type thing. Uh, a couple brothers in the band, and when Rob, I think, passed away, something happened to him. Kurt Verhey from Mace came in and replaced him a little while later. He's on this one. It was a trio by then with Fritz, Brian Fritz, and um, on I think guitar, and then Jerry Leonard on drums. Kurt plays bass. Um, so those guys are kind of cool. Um, Pretty cool technical kind of thrash band, sort of in the realm of Megadeth. Bitter End. This was their lone Metal Blade album in 91. This came out. This is a colored vinyl reissue that M Theory did, which is pretty cool. Um, they had a second album or started recording towards the second album, and that got shelved. Which later on that came out many years later. There was Black and Blue from Portland. This is their first record. Got a kind of a cool one of the ones Gene Simmons produced. I think this is the third album. It's kind of, I don't know if you can see it, it's signed by everybody, which is a cool present from a friend of mine a few years back. And so those guys started out in Portland. Um, Jamie St. James actually went to my high school. He's about 10 years before me in the 70s, Cleveland High School. And they started a band called Jet, which had a guy named Julian Raymond on vocals, who now is a producer in LA and does Cheap Trick Records and a bunch of stuff. And they kind of went through some different carnations with people kind of coming and going. Eventually, Tommy Thayer was in the band, and they did some showcases in LA. It didn't happen, um, and came back home. Ended up becoming Movie Star, which was kind of a Cars, hard rockin' sort of Cars type thing, a little more in that with some keyboards and stuff. Pretty popular in the Portland scene around the 79 to 81 sort of range. And then they got Pete Holmes on drums, but Julian left the band and moved to LA, and Jamie stepped up to do vocals, and they brought Pete Holmes in on drums. And as Pete told me in Rusted Metal, he was too heavy for the guy booking him, Andy Gilbert, and he didn't really like him, and he put him on some kind of Monday night crap and stuff. So they were going down for about a year, he said, going down to LA and playing a bunch of shows down there to great receptions at the Troubadour and Whiskey and a lot of places like that. And that was when a lot of that was just starting to happen with the LA hard rock metal scene was kind of breaking with Motley Crue and Dokken and a lot of those, Rat and so forth. And so they fit right in there and eventually got on the first Metal Blade compilation, Metal Massacre, and then eventually got signed. And so they did 4 records back then, split up late 80s, 89 or so, and got back together in various times over the years. And kind of in the Kiss sort of hard rock type of realm. Canadian band Black Knight, female fronted metal band. This kind of was a Cult Metal Classics reissued their lone album with some bunch of unreleased demos, so it's kind of a cool 2 LP set. They're pretty cool. Let's see what else I got here. Black Rose from Spokane did their own record, 0 Hour. This was 86. It's kind of interesting mix of sort of kitchen sink, where it's typical of some bands where they try to throw in too many different styles. So there's some pretty Dokken-ish, Rat sort of LA type metal stuff, and then there's some songs that really just don't fit on. So it's kind of like I said across the board. Word was these guys live would often cover like Whitesnake and stuff like that. Were pretty popular in that area. Let's see what else. Had a Blood Circus. It was an early sub pop band. It was pretty cool. This was Primal Rock Therapy, I think, is red vinyl. So yeah, kind of a cool band that didn't last through when grunge really broke out. They were kind of a crossover thing that was pretty cool, and unfortunately just didn't stick around long enough to hit big like some of the other bands. But Christian metal front, we got Blood Good, his first couple records. They're kind of interesting band in that the singer Les Carlson went back to being in Hair and in the early 70s and doing some Broadway musical type stuff, rock stuff like that, and I had a couple different bands with his wife, Joyce. Sticker was one of the more known ones before Blood Good. They had a record that was going around, kind of a pop rock sort of thing in the early 80s, and then he decided to go Christian metal and did 3 or 4 records, couple live records, and kind of split up, and got back together in recent years. Unfortunately, Michael Bloodgood passed away not too long ago. Was the founding bassist and one of the main songwriters, and but pretty cool, pretty good, straightforward heavy metal stuff. Pretty good, solid stuff. So let's see, what else do I have here? I guess you could kind of I don't know if you put these guys under O or B because they changed their name from Oily Bloodmen to the Bloodmen. This is a single. They were on a couple comps and had a couple demo tapes too, I believe. Pretty cool. I saw them at Satyricon back in the day. They were a pretty fun band. Kind of a crossover thing, definitely. Um, These guys didn't have a record, but they did have a couple comp tracks. Bondage Boys, which is kind of a cool band, played Lake Hills and Battle of the Bands and a lot of different shows around that time, early 80s. About 81 to about 84 they lasted or so. First singer was Gustav Moloff, who is now better known as Tammy Down from Faster Pussycat, his first band, real band. Vern White from Mace was in the band as well, and Pleasure Elite he was in, of course, too. But this Northwest Metal Fest compilation, which had Metal Church and Mace and Overlord and Lipstick and a bunch of other bands, that had a session at Triad. You can see them up in the corner there. Yeah, they were pretty wild for the time, and they had like cross-dressed a bit and a lot of leather and bondage type gear, and Tammy would whip like a dummy when they did Dehumanize Me, which we actually were fortunate enough, we did a compilation a couple years back on our Northwest Metalworks label called Lake Hills Revisited, with all bands that played. They're all hard rock and metal bands, Rail and TKO and Q5 and Lipstick and Overlord, a whole bunch of other bands. And we were fortunate to get an unreleased Bondage Boys track from that same session, which was the Dehumanize Me song, which is pretty cool. Very interesting crossover type band for the time. So yeah, and then a couple sort of honorable mentions, and of course there's a lot more bands. One thing I wanted to say I didn't say last time on letter A was I'm just talking about bands I've got props for, because otherwise I don't really have anything to show for some of these guys. There's other bands that exist. Some I didn't mention in the A episode that are cool was Assault and Battery, which we did actually. They had a couple tapes. They're a thrash metal band in Washington, and they gave us a track for our first Northwest Metalworks compilation. Assault was a Canadian metal band that had a record in like '86 that was pretty cool. Of course, I mentioned the Allies, which is a pop band, that had a big hit with Emma Peel, but still a cool local band. And there's definitely a few others that we, like I said, I just didn't have props to show. As far as a couple honorable mentions, I wanted to talk about Atom Bomb a little bit. Is Adam Brenner's band, who was in TKO and Tyrant, which was Jeff Tate sang for before he went on to be in the Queensryche a few years later. And Brenner went to New York and got a record deal after TKO broke up. This was his first record, was Fatal Attraction. It has Jimmy Crespo from Aerosmith and Phil Feet and Sandy Slavin from Riot. It's a really good band. It's a pretty solid record, definitely hard rock record, a little bit metal, sort of LA metals kind of area. Cliff Williams guests on bass and backing vocals on I Want My Heavy Metal. Did a few records, had a couple more in the 80s. Unfortunately, had some bad luck where he got in trouble with his management and the label dropped him, and so he kind of bounced from a couple different labels, but he's always put out some pretty solid stuff. So it's not really a Northwest band, but he is a Northwest guy. I figured I'd throw it out there. And on a non-metal front, I just wanted to mention Jim Bassnight and the Moberlys. He also started out, he had a band called The Mice, which opened for the Ramones and played one of the first probably the first organized punk show in May of '76 with the Telepaths and Tupperwares in Seattle, where they rented a hall out, and lasted for a couple years. The Mice, like I said, they opened for Ramones, did a bunch of demos and live stuff. Word is there's going to be, actually that stuff's going to be released not too far down the road here, I heard. Then he went on to do the Moberlys, which is a really cool power pop band, just really great singer-songwriter, guitarist, and just a lot of solid stuff there. A couple of the guys from the Moberlys in the early incarnation were Steve Pearson, and who went on to be in the Heats, and Don Short was also in there for a brief bit too. So a few other bands to mention. As like I said, there's definitely a lot more. James Bird, so a really great guitarist who's in Fifth Angel. He did a lot of solo stuff. Atlantis Rising was a great record, which Evan Sheely and Ken Mary play on. Brat with Paul Davidson played a lot of battles and at bands and shows at that point. Broken Toys was another cool band. Um, Body Bag was a cool thrash band in Portland. Um, Blasphemy, Vancouver, BC, thrash band. So yeah, like I said, we did this book, Rusted Metal. I didn't show it last time. I probably should. Um, Came out in the fall, winter of 2020. Finally, after working on it for about 6.5 years, it's 900 pages, over 600 bands, a bunch of interviews, venues, discography, and so on. So yeah, check it out. We still got copies for sale. NorthwestMetalworks.com. Thanks, guys. Take care. See you next week for letter C.